Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today, I am very much so a pleasure to be joined by Dr. Sandro Bartolomei. And Sandro tried to tell me how to pronounce his name. I still probably messed it up, but hopefully I got pretty close there. Awesome. And he recently authored a study titled New Perspectives and Resistance Training Periodization, Mixed Session versus Block Periodization Programs in Trained Men. And that's what we're going to kind of dive into today and kind of see if there's a periodization approach that is kind of better or worse for a certain individual. So I think a good place for us to start here is what kind of led you to wanting to do this study in the first place?
Welcome, everybody. My main interest in research and my main research topic is about periodization. So I'm doing research about periodization since 2014, when I start to collaborate with my team at the University of Bologna and also with other professors around the world, including Dr. Jay Hoffman, that was at that time chair at the University of Bologna and at the University of Central Florida. I spent 3 years there, and we did a lot of research about periodization. But now, during the COVID period, everything changed because coaches start to train athletes in a different way. Because one of the starting point of periodization was the day of the competition. And during the COVID time, coaches were not sure anymore about the day of the competition. So they start to use paradigm that allows athletes to switch in a very fast way from a load period to a download period and to reach a peak of performance very quickly. And this changed everything because, as we know, block periodization is very effective. But one of the most important things is to knowing exactly the day of the competition, because block periodization is based upon the delayed effect and cumulative effect of the different training loads. So if you have not enough time, it's very hard to reach a peak of performance in correspondence of the most important competition. That is actually the main goal of periodization. On the contrary, this model that we test in this study was exactly the opposite as block periodization. Block periodization is based upon a period, mesocycles, focus mainly on only one component of performance. On the contrary, mixed periodization, mixed session include within each training session different stimulus, different goals. And if we think about the principle that were first published at the end of the 70s by Verkhoshansky, that proposed block periodization, this is exactly the opposite. So block periodization is based upon the GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome. So you shock the organism and then there is a reaction. Mixed session periodization is based upon the variation. Variation of training stimuli may be as effective as block. We will discuss in this paper.
Perfect. I think that kind of lays things out very well. And to me, it's super interesting that one of the kind of catalysts to do this study is because of COVID and not knowing the specific day that someone was going to need to be at their kind of peak performance. And just to kind of give the audience an example of this, and you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that block periodization, you might do something like you might start with a block of training, 4 to 8 weeks, where you focus on just purely muscle growth. And then following that, you might focus on 4 to 8 weeks, just focus on strength. And then you might have another block following that, 4 to 8 weeks, focusing on power output or something like that to kind of peak your performance for a specific date down the line. So to me, it sounds like you guys wanted to compare kind of taking more of that block periodization approach compared to kind of doing more all in one training block. So maybe in a single training block, you incorporate muscle growth and strength and different adaptations kind of all in one. Does that kind of sound like a decent summary of kind of what you guys were looking at here?
Yes. To be honest, the first to try to combine within each week together different proposal for training and working on different component of performance was a polycan at the end of the 80s, in 1988, with the daily undulating periodization. And now this form of mixed session is like an extreme form of daily undulating periodization, in which the variation into the stimulus are within each training session. Block periodization was think to optimize performance and to obtain delayed and cumulative effect. But as I said, you need to know exactly when the peak of performance should be. And this is very important. The first point when you draw a training program is the competition. So.
Yep, I know that when I was working in my master's program, the first thing we would do is like, okay, when is the competition? And then we'd kind of reverse engineer the program from there to where we start with a competition day and then we build into that with kind of a block periodization schedule. So I think that sets things up really well for this study. And I think kind of moving on from here, what did you guys kind of do to test whether these mix sessions were as good as block periodizations? What were kind of the methods of the study here?
First of all, we select a group of highly trained individual, and we use 22 male resistance trained individual. 11 of them were competitive athletes in wrestling, were strength and power athletes competing in weightlifting, powerlifting. Some of them were among the best bench pressers in Italy. So they were very, very strong. And some of them were only sport enthusiasts. Some of them, as 80% of the study, were students. Because as a professor at university, it's very easy. It's easier for us to find people from there. But they were really trained individuals. As you can see from the average 1RM in squat, for example, was 143 kilograms. That is pretty good as a parallel squat. 115 kilograms for the bench press. And then we randomly assigned this participant into two groups, one assigned to block periodization group and the other one on a mixed session program. Both groups were tested, each individual were tested pre and post 10 weeks of training, including 5 training sessions per week. That is pretty high volume of training and very good. And to be included within the participant of this study, this guy should be able to lift at least 1.3 times their body mass in bench press, and they should not be injured in the last 2 years. And also their experience in the gym should be pretty good. They should train in the last 3 years about 3 times per week. That is not bad. And of course, they were really trained. Then we tested them for maximal strength using both dynamic tests as 1RM in squat and bench, but also isometric strength, such as leg extension, isometric, and also bench press, isometric. And we test also them for muscle architecture using a pretty interesting technology as muscle ultrasound that now is becoming more and more popular around the world for both performance and also research. Because using ultrasound, you can get a lot of information. In particular, in the study, we measure body muscle size, muscle thickness. So we test the hypertrophy, the gain in muscle in each muscle. So for example, the gain in the trapezius or in the vastus lateralis or in vastus medialis or in pectoral. So it was very interesting for that. This is not the first study to use that kind of technology. For example, in our lab, we did several studies that were also published on Journal of Strength and Conditioning and also on European Journal of Applied Physiology, using that technology to assess both acute changes in muscle architecture following resistance exercise and also chronic change following a period of training.
And just a couple kind of clarifying questions there. For your training programs themselves, did you equate their overall training volume, or were there other controls when it came to kind of the program overall? And then from that, did you have any controls with their nutrition? Like, did you look at their body weight gained or anything like that?
That's a very good question. So the two programs were equated in volume, but only if you look at the 10 weeks period, because of course a mixed session periodization was not. There were no changes across the 10 weeks. It was basically all the same. We include some kind of progression of loads because the loads were prescribed based upon the repetition in reserve. So if some changes in maximal strength occur within the 10 weeks, subjects were suggested to increase the load on the bar. So basically, there is an increase in the intensity of the load within 10 weeks, but the program was almost the same. On the contrary, in a block model, the first 4 weeks were focused on hypertrophy. So sets and repetition and the percentage of 1RM was different. For example, during the first 4 weeks, in some exercises, 10 sets of 10 reps were included. It is such a high volume. Was the German volume system was really, really tough. But then changes. So of course, in the first 4 weeks, the volume was much more elevated during the block model compared to the mixed session. However, in the 10 weeks, the training volume was exactly the same. So during the program, we collected a lot of information from the participant about their load on each exercise. Also, we collect information about the session RPE, and we calculate the session load by multiplying we asked how heavy was your training session from 0 to 10. 30 minutes following the last set of each session, and then we multiply this parameter for the length in time of the training, and we calculate the training load, the perceived training load, and then we compare in each mesocycle for the two training program. About the nutrition, I didn't respond about the nutrition, your question.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to follow up.
yes. So we asked two participants to fill a food log for 4 days during the entire 10 weeks. I know that it's not so much. However, the training, so the program was not focused on nutritional aspects, but on distribution of training workloads. And we just check if the amount of calories and macronutrients was corresponding to what was suggested by the American USDA. So if the subjects were included in the range suggested for active people, that was okay for us.
Gotcha. And were there any differences between the groups in terms of like how much protein they ate or how much body weight they gained or anything like that? Or was it pretty similar across both groups?
So we measure some differences by analyzing the food log. However, was connected to the body mass of the individual. So basically people that was heavier eat it more. We didn't allows people to use supplements during these 10 weeks. They were allowed only to use whey protein. That's it. So no creatine, no beta-alanine, no nothing else. No pre-workout.
Well, I think that sets things up very well here. We kind of have a good understanding now of the training programs, what you guys control for. So now to get to the good stuff, what did you guys find here? What were kind of the results of this study?
So the results are quite complicated to understand because we found opposite results for the different assessment. So what is clear is that mixed session periodization was significantly better for muscle hypertrophy. What we found is the increase in muscle thickness of the pectoral, for example, in vastus lateralis, was significantly more elevated following the mixed session program compared to the block one. So this program was really effective for muscle hypertrophy of different muscle and also for fat-free mass. So basically the individual were bigger, but they were also stronger. So if we take a look at the change in the 1RM, In bench, for example, the mixed session group obtained an increase by 8.5% versus 2% of the block periodization group. So mixed session was also more effective for maximal strength. However, if we take a look at power, the results are the opposite. Because in particular with the counter movement jump, the increase was significantly more elevated following the block model. And this opened a lot of perspective about periodization. Because block periodization was designed from the 70s probably to optimize power performance. So to become bigger in the first block, mesocycle, accumulation phase. In the second accumulation phase, working more on neural adaptation with maximal strength to become stronger. And then in the realization phase to become more powerful. So the last 2 weeks in our program was a sort of peaking phase. That is probably the reason why we found a significantly more elevated increase in counter movement jump compared to mixed session. Because in mixed session, there were no weeks of deloading, no peaking phase. So basically, following 72 hours following the last training session, we test them for post-test, post-training. So maybe 2 weeks of periodization following the mixed session program may increase the performance, especially in power. Because from previous research, we know that in order to digest the loads of training of the accumulation phase, we need time. And sometimes a longer phase of deloading or a phase of deloading following mixed session contents may be optimal for athletes.
To me, to kind of try to summarize to make sure I'm understanding everything correctly here. So the mixed session group, they experience significantly better muscle growth and strength. However, the kind of more block periodization group, they had better kind of power performance at the end. And for the reason that the power group was better, it sounds like you kind of think that it might be related to that group. They still were just like 72 hours post their kind of mixed session. So they potentially had some accumulated fatigue that was still carried over into that session. So maybe they didn't have the time to kind of, like you said, digest their training program and kind of benefit from the accrued strength and muscle to actually be able to kind of represent that power in a test. Does that also sound fair to say?
So I think it's a good interpretation. In block periodization model, there is no overlapping between the different contents of training. So we know that the first period is hypertrophy and there is no power, no exercises for power. So there is not a concurrent effect of training. However, when you mix contents, even if our training session in the mixed session program started with power, so there is not a negative direct effect of high volume training on power, because every training session starts with jumps or bench press throw on a medicine ball throw, but everything focused on power. Then we move to maximal strength in the middle phase of each training session, and then to hypertrophy at the end of the training session. But there is an overlapping between the different contents of training. So what happened to the power adaptation when during the same training session you introduce some contents with high volume, maybe for the same muscle groups? There is a concurrent effect on the muscle. And probably what happened is that you mix together everything. The power results are not optimal, but based upon the results in maximal strength and hypertrophy is the average reaction of the body. So the high intensity training together with power activate a lot of fast fibers, and also works on the neural component of strength. Then when you switch to hypertrophy within the same training session, you are not gonna lose the adaptation to nervous system. However, you introduce something else, and this stimulates hypertrophy, but does not contribute to further adaptation on power. I think a good combination of training may be mixed session for 10 weeks, for example, and then maybe the last block, the realization phase of block periodization with very low volume and only power, and then may maximize the adaptation obtained in the first 10 weeks. But of course, following this study, we know that even if you perform some heavy high volume training following power exercise, there is an effect. There is an effect. So you may lose some adaptation toward increase in power. And you, of course, you need time to digest, because fatigue makes a lot of, is very powerful fatigue. So may reduce performance. Another option may be to perform high intensity training and then power. And a lot of training in contrast, complex training, use this sequence in order to obtain the post-activation performance enhancement effect. But I think that this strategy should be used only in proximity to the competition, not so far, because if the training volume is too elevated, then there is no way to transform into power. So you need time. You need time to reduce fatigue and obtain what you are supposed to do. Because if you work for hypertrophy during that period, power may not be the first goal. You are more focused on something else.
Yep, absolutely. And I think one common mistake that I'll see people make is they kind of constantly try to train for all three, power, strength, and hypertrophy at the same time. And they don't really realize that you're probably going to have a really hard time maximizing any kind of one direction there if you're trying to like do them all at once. So it sounds like if you do have a program to where it's like strength and hypertrophy oriented, you need some sort of, I really like how you kind of said digestion period, to where you can then take those adaptations and more focus on that power and to kind of realize those increases in adaptations. And one kind of other question here is, for the group that improved their muscle and strength more in the mixed sessions, do you think that's maybe because they just kind of spent more time overall doing higher volumes and higher training volumes? Or why do you kind of think that that mixed session group saw kind of better strength and hypertrophy compared to kind of the block periodization group?
Probably in order to obtain the best results in hypertrophy, you need also a lot of time dedicated to muscle hypertrophy in terms of days and weeks. So with mixed session, some contents focus on muscle hypertrophy were included within the entire period of 10 weeks. On the contrary, in block, only 4 weeks were dedicated to hypertrophy. And this is a problem, especially when you train female athletes. Because in female athletes, the adaptation toward hypertrophy may be lost very quickly. And this is very important because in a previous paper that we published on Journal Strength and Conditioning, we compare block versus traditional Matveyev periodization. So trying to reproduce the model that was proposed by Matveyev in 1958, that is actually an undulating model, including contents of muscle hypertrophy within each mesocycle. And that periodization model was better for female individuals compared to block, because block included hypertrophy content only in the first mesocycle, and that not anymore. But for female athletes, female individuals, that was not the best choice, because they lose adaptation on hypertrophy very quickly, probably due to the lack of testosterone, for the low level of testosterone within the bloodstream. So for them, but also for male, may be a problem. Maybe 4 weeks of hypertrophy are not enough. To be honest, the first to use a sort of mixed session periodization model was the Chinese weightlifters that start to introduce following training at the end of the training session focus on maximal strength and power, typically including weightlifting exercises, some localized monoarticular concentrated exercises for some muscle with high volume protocols. So with both mechanical and metabolic stress at the end of the training session. So they were the first to introduce to use this kind of periodization.
Well, I think that gives a very good overview of the study and kind of some main kind of takeaways of it. If you were just going to give like a couple of core takeaways from the study that might be kind of practical takeaways that someone can consider when developing their own programs or developing programs for others, what would kind of be some of the few takeaways that kind of are suggested from this study?
Block periodization, we know that is effective, especially for power, and especially when you have time to obtain delayed and cumulative effects of the different training loads. However, when the goal is only maximal strength and hypertrophy, as this study shows, other model of periodization, such as mixed session, may be useful. Maybe can be useful to put together within each training session maximal strength at the beginning of each training session and then hypertrophy. Maybe you can also change the muscle groups involved. But this kind of stimulus is very effective for as I said, maximal strength and hypertrophy, and especially because you variate a lot the training program. So every day you change the goal, and from also a psychological perspective, this is very stimulating compared to a block model in which for 4 weeks you destroy your body basically because there is an accumulation phase and you need a lot of training volume to stimulate hypertrophy.
Awesome. Well, I really like those takeaways. And if someone wants to stay up to date on kind of the work you're doing, new research that you have coming out, is there anywhere that people can follow you or to stay up to date with kind of the work you're doing?
By typing periodization and my name on Google Scholar, we can find probably a lot of paper, and there are also very good authors in the US. I work with some of them and they are awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.